What is it that people whose names we recognize, who we know something about, how well did they plan that third act, the last stage of their life? Ozzy has to get some of the credit, so don't get me wrong. Sharon was important for Ozzy, hugely important. I'm convinced that if Sharon didn't come along, nobody may remember much about Ozzy at this point.
Welcome to Life's Third Act, an enlightening look at estate planning, retirement, and beyond.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. Today, I'm going to talk about Ozzy Osbourne. Ozzy Osbourne, I don't think is a name that any of you have to be introduced to. He's, I would say, more infamous than famous, but in any case, he was quite a presence on the music scene the last, 30 years of the 20th century and probably the first 10 plus years of this century. So he had a lot of stamina professionally, which came as a surprise to everyone given the way his life was lived and its ups and downs. And so when I think about Ozzy, I think about the fact that he had this incredible success early on, mainly with Black Sabbath, but then his life started a downward spiral, drugs, alcohol primarily, but other issues, behavioral issues, whatnot. And so he was thrown out of the band that he and another, so he was a co-founder of Black Sabbath, he's thrown out of the band. So this is 79 or so. So what looked like pretty much the end of him, the sort of implosion for which rock stars are notorious, particularly young rock stars, as he was at that time, early 20s. The trajectory is pretty clear, and it's very unusual to have someone who, from those circumstances, kind of pull themselves up by the bootstraps, always with the help of others, almost always. And then they move on to comparable success, or in Ozzy's case, greater success. So he had great success, then greater failure, very conspicuous failure, and then in the midst of these doldrums and whatnot, he arises to even greater success than he had had before, which endures for decades, really up until his death. I mean, he performed a concert, I think it was like a week or two before his death. So, I mean, he was active up until the bitter end. And his life got much more stable. His success was much more stable. So he's a very interesting person to look at and to talk about. And I think maybe if I were thinking of a headline for this show, it would be something like more a miracle than a role model. In other words, we can all stand back impressed and wonder at the fact that Ozzy managed to recover in such a fantastic way and to hang on for the rest of his life. But yet, because of the complications and because of the problems that endured, including drugs and alcohol, so he became sober. In fact, he became sober a bunch of times. And so that was kind of the nature of his battle with substances. And yet he managed to hang on, and he managed to maintain some substantial measure of control. So it's an impressive story in many ways, but again, as impressive as it is, it's not something that you'd really want to emulate in that fashion. So let's talk about a few of the things, some what we might call quick facts that many of you may not know, to just bring home this idea of how important or how successful Ozzy Osbourne was. So let's look at a few things to sort of bring home more who Ozzy was, for those of you who may not know much of anything about him, and then to talk about some I think milestones that show how successful he was professionally. So some quick facts. He died in July of this year. He was 76 years old. I think it was Parkinson's related. I know he had had Parkinson's. I think that was ultimately the cause of death, directly or indirectly. Net worth, estimated, this is a wide margin, but this is the best I could find from the sources we looked at, somewhere between $220 million and $337 million. Ozzy was a brand. He had a reputation, and he commanded loyal followers. And it was multimedia, and a little bit more on that in a few minutes. He had 6 children from 2 marriages. Of those children, 1 was adopted. His spouse at the end, for the last, from 82 to his death, was Sharon Osbourne. And Sharon has to be mentioned in any discussion about Ozzy's success. I mean, Sharon was the one who came along as the daughter of Ozzy's manager, who, having met Ozzy in 72 or so, she and Ozzy were probably 4 years apart in age. Ozzy was older, but they didn't date at that time. But she saw and met Ozzy through her dad, who managed Black Sabbath and successfully managed Black Sabbath at that time. So later she comes along. Ozzy's been fired. Record companies want nothing to do with him. He has this reputation. His life has been so flamboyant and flammable, in a manner of speaking, that they just, record companies thought, look, this guy's been there. He had some success, but he's not going to get it back. And some question whether he should have had that success anyway. Black Sabbath was a little bit of a controversial band, both musically and just reputationally generally. But you can see why there weren't people knocking at Ozzy's door. So Ozzy was on his back, and he was getting worse in terms of his substance abuse at that time. He was contemplating not recording, believe it or not. He was thinking that, look, this is the end of my career. Look, he's in his early 20s still, later 20s. And so he's, at that time, I think he could realistically have concluded that this is not how I'm going to make a living. This was a great gig, but it's not going to be here. I don't think anyone regarded Ozzy as a great singer. I don't think anyone's under that illusion. He was good. But what he had, kind of like Alice Cooper, what he had was this boldness on stage, this charisma, various other intangibles, which you could articulate as well as I could, perhaps. They're things that are hard to measure, but it's not as if he played an instrument and played extraordinarily well, or even that he was a great singer. But he was a good front man, which includes more than singing. In any case, it was Sharon who comes along. They renewed their relationship late in the 70s. They date, they marry. But even before they marry, probably around 80, she's the one who's telling Ozzy, don't go look for a band, which was plan B. It's either quit the music industry, go do something else, or B, which I think he may have been considering more when she came along, was you need to form a new band. She said to Ozzy, no, you are a star. You're the personality. You're the front person to your own career. And she persuaded him that you don't need a band and you shouldn't have a band. And so she lined up. When I say have a band, I mean be in a band. She lined up musicians for him, or helped him line them up. She lined up a label that was willing to take some risk with him at the time, and it was largely through her arguments, perhaps entirely through her arguments and connections. And so whenever you talk about Ozzy's phoenix-like rise from the ashes and the fact that he sustained himself, in this a little bit shaky condition I kind of described, where he's not fully recovered from the substance abuse, but he's recovering in the most tentative sense of the word throughout the next 3 decades or so. So I really want to emphasize Sharon and how important she was to his life. So in terms of his success, let's talk a little bit about a few of those milestones. He co-founded Black Sabbath, we mentioned that. And they did pioneer this sort of heavy metal music. So it's fair for them to say that they owned or originated heavy metal as we came to know that in the 90s, for example, especially in the 90s. So, yeah, Black Sabbath was important. Critics at the time, it's funny, were not impressed at all with Black Sabbath. Rolling Stone, the music critics just felt that, it was a very simplistic sort of music. They didn't see great artistry on instruments. They didn't have a great guitarist at the time. Even Ozzy said that later. He wanted to go back and re-record, and did re-record some of the tracks from like Master of Reality and some of the early albums because he didn't think the guitarmanship was as good as it can be. And I don't want to be unfair to the guitarist, Tony something. Do you remember his name?
Iommi.
I don't want to be unfair. Do you think I'm being unfair to him?
Ooh, that's a loaded question.
In other words, he has fans who are guitarists who like him.
One thing about Tony Iommi is like his style wasn't like exactly technically proficient, but he developed his own style just because of getting his fingertips chopped off. So it's like his style was totally different.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was funny because he was like getting ready to go on tour.
What? Wait! Tell us what happened.
So he worked at like a machine shop or something like that, and it wasn't even his shift, I don't think, or he went back for a shift when he was supposed to be leaving for his tour, and machine chopped the tips of his finger off. So he had to like completely redo how he played guitar.
And this was he in Black Sabbath at the time?
I think he was just joining it, if I remember. So but I could be wrong.
At the very beginning, probably. That's more believable than Anyway, so it's there are bands who critics love from day one. The musicianship often of instrumentals or the tremendous vocalists. Black Sabbath didn't get that sort of reception, but I think they came to be respected in large part because they kind of were the forerunners in a genre of music that ultimately became very popular. Oddly enough, it became more popular a decade later than it was when they started playing this type of music. So Black Sabbath was an accomplishment, lots of awards and stuff, Hall of Fame. So that was where Ozzy was up until he was thrown out in 1979, and then he successfully launched his solo career. Ended up selling tens of millions of albums as a solo artist. I didn't note how many albums he came out with, but he was pretty consistent in coming out with albums up through the 90s and through part of the teens or the aughts of the 21st. So Grammy Awards, he's won 5 Grammys, 3 as a solo artist and 2 with Black Sabbath. He is inducted in the UK Music Hall of Fame, in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Lifetime Achievement Awards, Legacy Awards, created Ozzy Fest in 96, which continued to be pretty much an annual event, bringing hundreds of thousands of people together up until I think their last regular event was like in 2018. And it's now, Sharon has announced in the last year that they're going to revive it. So I just think it got some inattention from Ozzy in particular. Historically, he had always been at the event, and that was real important to its success, I think. But and then and we can't fail to note this. I mean, Ozzy goes on to this television career, and the Osbournes, which was a reality TV show. It was the first of its kind, not a first reality TV show. It was the first reality TV show in which a celebrity family participated. Now we have Kardashians and other things where people know the people who are doing the show. In other words, before the show starts, people know who these people are, and they kind of be themselves doing the show. That was original. And MTV was the one that, I think Osbournes was on MTV. Yeah. And it was a huge success, ran for 4 seasons, and it did not discontinue because of lack of interest. This was the case where the Osbournes, Sharon and Ozzy and the kids, they got tired of doing it, and I get that. It became a big intrusion in their lives. The show became very popular, lots of viewers. MTV would have ridden this on for as long as they could, but Ozzy and Sharon decided that it was just too much. It was fun the early days, but they got tired of it. So they discontinued doing that. They walked away. So that show ends after, 54 or so episodes. Then Ozzy did a show with Jack, one of his sons, and Jack and Ozzy show, something to that effect. It's a name like that. And it ran for a couple of seasons. I don't think it enjoyed the success of the Osbournes. The Osbournes was just something America had never seen before. And that's another reason we talk about Ozzy's success. Sure, people may be able to say that he wasn't a great singer. He was a good singer, don't get me wrong. But I think that in fairness, he wasn't great. But when you put together the other qualities he had, those things that you can't quite put your finger on, but yet he's hugely popular. People love him. Well, it turns out the camera loves him too. And he just had this ability on screen as well as in live concerts. He just had this appeal. And, when somebody has that, it's like lightning in a bottle. You're not sure exactly what it is, but it's powerful. And that was, some people will know him primarily as a TV figure more than they will as a rock star, depending on your age. So that's an overview of Ozzy. I want to move on and talk about kind of Ozzy from estate planning perspective. And this is really what this show's about. We like to focus on, what is it that people whose names we recognize, who we know something about, how well did they plan, that third act, the last stage of their life. And I can tell you that Ozzy perhaps due less to great planning than to just great circumstances. Ozzy has to get some of the credit, so don't get me wrong. Sharon was important for Ozzy, hugely important. I'm convinced that if Sharon didn't come along, we may not be talking. Nobody may remember much about Ozzy at this point. That's just my view. Some would disagree, I'm sure. So we have to mention her, and we think about the plan either way you view it. But Ozzy had a role, and he doubtlessly gained maturity. He gained some level of self-control. He kept the substance addiction at bay, and he had a life that was longer than many people whose youth was spent as his was. He chose to plan. He chose to create a plan that was a wonderful estate plan, and it turned out that in the last probably 2 decades of his life, he was able to enlarge his fortune substantially, in part because he was becoming more conscious about management. Of course, his wife was an ever-present influence. She continued to be the primary business manager of his career. So she, in fact, was managing the money and to a great extent managing the events that he did. But it was Ozzy that did the events. And so Ozzy, he's the star and he's the source of all the income, but he's not the reason that he had it at the end, is my point. So again, Ozzy, my perspective in this show is to say that Ozzy, the overall point here is Ozzy is kind of miraculous to look at how well his life turned out, but it's a little unfair to call it serendipity, but you just get the sense that, whoa, there's several near-death experiences, some close calls in his career, and that it could easily have just come apart, and it didn't. So I think there was this steadying presence that came along in 1980. And then there was Ozzy's contribution. So I don't want to fail to concede that. So now let's talk about the estate planning piece. Ozzy did do estate planning. There was a wonderful plan that was in place. Now, one of the frustrating things about this discussion with you is that I don't know a lot of these tales, so there is some speculation involved because the nature of trusts are, as we've talked on this show often, is that they're private, which if we were talking about your estate planning, you'd be grateful for that. But in this case, we wish we knew more, but we know enough to make some pretty intelligent speculations based upon the reporting around the estate planning. So we know, though, that there was an elaborate plan in place. We know that that plan had been discussed with the children, which is what's one of the things that we think is a critical component whenever you're doing estate planning is this communication factor. We had a framework here that was amenable to good estate planning, and it made the job of the person who's trying to plan well their exit from this world and to assure that the things they truly value are best protected and assured after they leave. It makes that job a little easier if you have certain conditions in your life. And those conditions are usually not entirely serendipitous. Some often are. There's luck in all of our lives, but also there are things that Ozzy, in this case, Ozzy did to assure that he had in place a family structure that was more amenable to having a workable plan that could be in place for decades thereafter. I mean, if you have a catastrophic family in which there's lots of conflict, lots of animosity, boiling resentments, etc., dishonesty, all those things that can make a mess of a family, especially one in which there's wealth to be divided among them in some fashion. So in this case, though, Ozzy really worked hard, and you have to give him this among other things. He worked really hard to restore his relationship with his children. And his children seemed to be impressively forgivable. I mean, they really, kids who've lived through that where Ozzy, I admire the fact in which he was completely transparent about his shortcomings as a father. I mean, he's just brutally honest about himself. And he neglected his kid, meaning that the kids had money, but they didn't have Ozzy. And Ozzy had other things going on. Even after he became or was trying to become sober, after Sharon came on the scene, there's still that next decade or so where, he continued to struggle to take care of building his career at that point, which was so important. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that this phoenix was in fact going to rise from the ashes, and it did. And yet it didn't happen just because. Yes, Sharon was there, but Ozzy's the one who had to get out there and do it. And his 90s were focused on that. So it means that you have the 70s in which he was not focusing on his kids, the 80s, arguably some of the 90s. I mean, there was a point where he started coming around, and he started coming around early enough to make a difference. And I don't know that it tells of that. I just know that when I heard the kids talk before and especially after his death, there's a lot of respect for him. There's not a lot of anger that's been reported among the kids, and usually that stuff makes its way into print. In this case, it seems that Ozzy was he worked hard at restoring his relationship with his kids. And it wasn't just at the end that you can do that. You can't do that in the last 2 years of your life. So let's stop here. Today I talked about Ozzy's career. I talked about his life and a little bit of background about him. And I want to break this into two parts so that in the next episode, I'll pick up from where I'm leaving off now, and I'll talk about, that last third of his life, the decisions he made, the planning he did, what was his estate plan, what were his circumstances financially, etc. So we'll talk about those things in the next episode. So I hope that you tune in for the next episode of Life's Third Act. Till then, take care.
We hope you enjoyed Life's Third Act, sponsored by Cordell & Cordell, your advisors for estate planning and beyond. Subscribe and join us weekly for thought-provoking discussion and topics exclusively focused on estate planning and your financial future. Discover more at CordellCordell.com. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.